Thank you very much, Professor Lumumba. Today's theme is all about accelerating public sector performance. And once again, Africa had been colonized. Then even public sector itself had been just implemented during the independence, when Africa was given independence. But we are still struggling in a number of factors. Then with today's themes, do you think Lesotho and Africa as a whole have so much to improve?
First of all, let us accept the fact that the civil service that we inherited from the colonizers was a civil service that was designed to assist the colonial administration. And one of the things that the post-colonial governments tried to do is to inject a sense of patriotism in the manner in which the civil service was going to conduct itself. And there is a sense in which, acting from the momentum of those days, the civil service was largely neutral, the civil service was largely professional, the civil service had to deal with smaller population, the civil service was not, in many countries, informed purely by ethnicity. But after many countries settled into the comfort of the post-colonial political climate, one can say that in a number of countries, issues such as ethnicity, political patronage, nepotism, and quite a number of negative things took center stage, with the consequence that performance began to dwindle, and the dwindling of the performance was further exacerbated by the growing population and the greater expectation. The net effect is that in many countries you now have a population that complains about the good old days, complains about the postal services that were working well, complains about electricity that we enjoyed without interruption, complains about cheaper goods in the shops, complains about good agricultural policies, complains about the absence of agricultural extension officers, with the net effect, therefore, that there is legitimacy in posing the question, which is the theme of this conference: what can we do to improve the performance of the civil service in modern African countries? And I'm using the word modern to define post-colonial, not to mean that everything African was not modern in its own way.
In years 1980, 1990, and also 2000, there were some reforms that were taken or done in Africa towards public sector improvement. How far are we from that? We know that we've been helped with the MDGs, which Africa is still struggling to achieve some of the goals that have been set up within.
Africa has been sometimes a laboratory in which experiments that are conceived in the West are tried out. And that is how I can explain the structural adjustment programs which were implemented in a number of African countries in the 1980s. It is now accepted that the structural adjustment programs implemented in Africa, courtesy of the World Bank and the International Monetary Funds, were a monumental failure. And they were a failure because they were textbook positions applied in an environment that did not quite allow them to thrive. What one can therefore say is that if you want things to work, they must have a domestic component. They must be homegrown. That does not mean that we don't borrow from best practices from elsewhere. We can, but we must customize them in a manner that is responsive to the realities on the ground. As long as Africa continues to import lock, stock, and barrel, things that are done in different contexts, and they bring them here, we then realize sooner rather than later that one size does not fit all. And that is why progressively now, in many African countries, we have visions that are articulated and are designed to be responsive and sensitive to the realities that are unique to the circumstances of the countries that we are talking about. And that is how I understand the ongoing conversation in Lesotho now. The Lesotho we want, the Lesotho that the Basotho want, And I'm beginning to debate, perhaps one may say I'm trying to be a little bit semantic in this regard. Is it the Lesotho we want or the Lesotho that we need? That is a debate that I leave to you. But I am convinced that the Basotho themselves will define for themselves what do we want, and once they have defined that, they'll work at it in a manner that will be sensitive to the realities of Lesotho, and once they implement it, it will satisfy the Basotho.
Recruitment policies and organizational performance is a critical issue for public sector. Where do you think we should start as an African? Do we have any collaboration? Do we cooperate? Do we have right leadership to implement all that?
The political class must be reminded that politics by its very nature can be volatile. They must be reminded that the politicians come and go every election cycle, but they must also be sensitive to the fact that service delivery must not be dependent on temporal political circumstances. And that is why the concept of the professionalism of the civil service and the neutrality of the civil service is critical. A good civil servant and a good civil service must be ready to work in any political environment in order to articulate and implement what is in the long-term best interest of the country. Once that is done, then Lesotho will realize their potential. I'm aware, for example, that in the early days, Lesotho did have permanent secretaries. These were individuals who were appointed on the basis of their expertise. They rose from the ranks. They knew the system. Then, courtesy of short-term political interest, this was done away with, and you introduced principal secretaries, who largely are individuals who are appointed on the basis of political patronage. And they are appointed for a very short time, and they serve at the whims of the politician. When they do that, then they can't give their all, they can't be dedicated. As long as you have nepotism and clientelism as the basis of appointment of individuals in the civil service cannot deliver.
And this had been an accusation that had been about incompetent professionals being appointed to senior management position and undue political influence. Do you think Africa anytime soon can change from that for better public service performance?
Let me make myself clear. I am not one who believes that individuals in public service should not be appointed by serving politicians. When somebody is elected as the president and he constitutes his government, he or she must appoint people into public service. What we need to do through our constitution, through our laws, is to ensure that the hands of the president and the hands of those who are serving under him are tied, or if not tied, are directed by law, which is enacted that ensures that in appointing individuals, they are individuals who are competent and knowledgeable in the things that they are appointed to do. If we do that, then we will have an environment where people do what they are competent to do. You don't put round pegs in square holes and expect them to fit. You don't, as I said during my lecture, ask a chicken to perform the task of a duck. The duck will quack, the duck will swim, but the chicken cannot. Ask people to do what they are qualified to do, competent to do, demand that they do them, subject them to performance contract, supervise them, giving them operational autonomy, but ask them to deliver and measure what they are delivering. And if they do that, then you will ensure that the people are served, and the people once served will be happy and the feedback will be positive. Otherwise, the people will be in a permanent state of dissatisfaction.
You spoke about the African leaders that have been summoned to the either Asians or Europeans and Americans, then Africa being the laboratory. We are moving from 2015, whereby we had MDGs. Now we are talking about the SDGs. Africa is still having over 1 billion people living below poverty. Where is Africa failing?
You know, when we talk about Millennium Development Goals and the SDGs, I always find myself amused amused because when we started with the MDGs in the year 2000, we said that within 15 years, we will have dealt with the 8 Millennium Development Goals. You and me know, and I've said it and it's known, it is only Rwanda which I think moved closest to achieving those Millennium Development Goals, and possibly Botswana. The rest of the 52 African countries did not achieve the Millennium Development Goals. The world, once again meeting in New York in the year 2015, now under Vision 2030, came up with the Sustainable Development Goals. There are now 17 of them, and they are largely a rehash of what we saw in the Millennium Development Goals. African countries individually also do have their own development plans, and they have their own visions, which articulate or re-articulate and domesticate those Sustainable Development Goals. But remember that quite a number of African countries also depend on aid from donor countries. When you depend on aid from donor countries, the net effect is that this aid is sometimes conditional. And when they are conditional, it means that sometimes you've got to do the bidding of whoever is financing you, and therefore you cannot deliver the things that you promised. In order to move forward, I am of the considered view that we as a people in individual African countries must cut our cloth according to our size. And if we do so, we'll promise ourselves the things that we can deliver. Dambisa Moyo, the young Zambian economist, in her book Dead Aid, says, and I agree with her, that aid cannot solve African problems. No country ever got out of poverty through aid that is given by others. Don't talk to me about the Marshall Plan after the World War II. It was in a different context. It was not aid. There were grants that were given largely to the Germans, and that worked then and not now. And therefore, I am of the view that as long as we don't define our goals and as long as we don't finance those goals, we can never achieve them. Which brings me to a corollary question that you are about to ask, but you did not ask. Now that African countries are being summoned, and I use the word summon, not because it is a summon, it's an invitation, but I use it to express my disgust. Because many of these meetings that I see are reminiscent of the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, which partitioned Africa. Asia, China is calling us, Russia is calling us, Japan is calling us, Europe is calling us. It is Africans who are called. Have you ever heard them calling Latin America? It is us who are called, and each one of these individuals, each one of these countries is making demands of us. There is no free lunch. When the Chinese say we are giving you 60 billion, when the Russians are saying they are giving us 20 billion, when the Japanese are saying they are giving us 40 billion, when the Europeans are saying they are giving us billions, whatever they are, there must be a quid pro quo. And that quid pro quo must be in their best interest. We cannot afford that luxury. But I'm a believer in trade. I believe if Africans remove tariff and non-tariff barriers, I'm a believer that if we could improve intra-African trade from the current 13 or 14% to 60% in the next 15 years, then we have a big market, which is nearly 1.5 billion. Then we are going to lift the 1 billion that you talked about wallowing into poverty. We are going to create opportunities. We are not only going to talk about employment, we are going to have situations where we have young men innovating and inventing. And where you see challenges, there will be opportunities. And our young men and women, if they are given the right environment and opportunities and political support, can lift Africa and lift her to the next orbit of economic development.
How do you help or change the countries like Lesotho, where there's a high wage bill, with being the highest employee in the country, this private sector, which you mentioned in your lecture? Then how do you build a collaboration between all those that we have the country and improve public sector services?
Lesotho is a country, as was defined by everybody who spoke there. Everybody who spoke said, Lesotho is a rich country. There must be something that the Basotho see that makes them call their country rich, and it is, in terms of the resources that she has. She has water, which she is supplying to South Africa. She is capable of generating electricity. She is surrounded by a country which has a population of nearly 58 million. She has a terrain which can be used if one were to use agriculture that is informed by technology to produce food. She is capable of making herself a magnet in a very unique way, not only for South Africa, but for the 14 or 15 countries within SADC and even beyond her. And I think that there are countries that we can draw from. Lesotho should not complain that she is landlocked. No. As somebody once said, what you think is landlocked is actually land-linked. And I think Lesotho is therefore land-linked. Being land-linked as she is, she can borrow from what the Rwandese are doing. Become a center for something, and you can be. You can borrow from what the Singaporeans do. You have a population of possibly slightly over 2 million. So population is not the problem. It's not the size of the population, but how that population is oriented in a manner that will open the resources of the country. Invite what I call public-private sector engagements in a manner that is meaningful. You know, this PP or private sector, public sector engagements, if they are not properly defined, what happens is that the private sector swallows the public sector. But it can be done in such a way that there is mutual benefit and ultimately benefit for the people. So without giving a long answer to a short question, I'm saying it is for the political leadership to define what they want and to move the people in that direction. And there is no shortage of countries which have demonstrated that that can be achieved, and it can be achieved within a very short time.
Wrapping up our discussion, you talked about 2063 that has been meant by AU. There are quite a number of things that had been tabled within that document: silencing the guns, free trade, Univisa, even natural resources of each country benefiting one country. Then what's your view regarding that?
You know, Vision 2063 is a beautiful document. And see me saying it is a beautiful document. Within itself, it contains beautiful promises, but beauty of documents and beauty of promises in and of themselves are not useful as long as we fold our hands and do nothing. We must, in the nature of things, fold our sleeves and begin to work towards them. And that document must be seen in the context of other subsequent developments. Africa Continental Free Trade Area, how are we implementing that? But even before we implement that, we must ask ourselves, within SADC, are you obeying? Is SADC implementing the treaties here? Are there no tariff and non-tariff barriers between South Africa and Lesotho? Is it possible to move goods without let and hindrance from here to Lesotho, from here to South Africa, and beyond South Africa to Namibia, and to Botswana, and to Eswatini, and other countries? In a nutshell, therefore, I'm saying, Africa must move beyond declarations. Africa must go into the arena of implementations. Once we begin to implement, we'll make mistakes, but we will make mistakes outside of the drawing board. As it is now, we are merely on the drawing board, and we are celebrating the architectural designs. Beyond the architectural designs, let us start laying the foundation. And once we lay the foundation, let us start building. If we do that, block by block, the promises of Africa Agenda 2063 can be realized by 2063. As it is now, one of the promises will not be met. The guns will not be silenced in the year 2020. In fact, I see and hear many more guns emerging from different parts of Africa. Let us not have our spirits dampened. Good things can be done, and they can only be done once we wed our words with our deeds.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. God bless.